Welcome to the Mental Fitness Podcast in partnership with Eliza Chat, where we explore real tools and stories for building mental strength in the modern world.
We're joined today by our guest, Dr. Kimberly Applewhite. Dr. Applewhite,
maybe you can just give us the synopsis from like a LinkedIn standpoint of like your academic background, and maybe if you after you do that, you can incorporate this question. What drew you to this kind of work? I think that there's some parts that are obvious about what might have drawn you there, but you didn't have to go there. And there's parts of what you've done that you've taken on that isn't part of your background, but you've chosen to help marginalized communities. So the brief synopsis of your career and then what drew you into this line of work.
Okay. My name is Dr. Kimberly Applewhite. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I work in the Salt Lake City area. I'm child trained initially, but now do work mostly with chronically suicidal individuals or just like the people that need a little love. So that's what I do as a therapist. I'm also really involved in the music community theater scene here. So those are some of the things that I do. I also run my mouth wherever I am invited to. So I've written a few essays for some books. I've been on a few podcasts, and I was a TEDx Salt Lake City speaker last year in 2024. And what I'm really passionate about is helping people access their inner wisdom and also feel less guilt about some of the things that they do to cope and survive. A lot of the people I work with need to fundamentally change everything about their lives, but I want people to do that from a rooted sense of self and understanding who they are. And so that idea, I think, is what influenced me to be a psychologist. Selfishly, I wanted to be a doctor. So I knew it was going to be a terminal degree, but I really saw early on as a kid, the impact that one-on-one relationships could have in improving self-esteem and changing outlook. Yeah. And I sensed that it could really change a lot of people's outcomes if they had that understanding of themselves early on. And so, yeah, those are some of the things that influenced my work, and they have stuck with me.
That's beautiful.
That's awesome.
Explain code switching.
Okay.
Basic definition, and then we can get into its implications.
Sure. So I think many cultures have this idea that in some settings you can use certain types of language, and in other settings you can use different types of language that sometimes doesn't overlap with that other place. So we are more comfortable being emotionally vulnerable with our friends, maybe, if our friends are good, or our parents, if our parents are good. But when we're in trouble with our parents, maybe we are not comfortable using the same types of language. We might be more official by the book, or we might be more emotionally uninhibited, which sometimes leads to problems, right? So anyway, there's just these rules about what kind of language we can use in different settings. And we kind of use something about the context to help us make those decisions. And so sometimes we're in situations where you may be in one context and then the environment switches. There's new factors there's new people. It's kind of like if you're in a lecture hall and everybody's talking and then the professor comes in, you are then quiet. So there's something about your language that is switching. And so that, in essence, is a general sense of what it means to code switch. So we all have this sense of contextually, I can do this here. I may not be able to do the same things.
Yeah.
And if the environment switches, I will then switch my behavior. And so it's often used in the context of Black people or people of color to describe this idea that in some settings, we can use a fuller range of language, or we can use different slang, or we can use insider language that some people, we are pretty confident that group will understand. But if there are different people that come in, if people are being watched by others, being observed, then there might be differences in what we feel like communicating. So if you're at a barbecue and you're using certain slang and you're like laughing and carrying on, and then like somebody from a different culture comes and you're like, oh, how is it going? What? Like, how is your day? There's something about the languages switching, but also tone, and sometimes the subject changes. So all of these are related to rules that we switch when we decide that the environment is switching.
Okay. So how does that, from a mental health standpoint, you've talked about how it can take an emotional toll. I mean, what you described there just sounds like normal, like, oh, when I'm with my high school buddies, I act one way. And then when I'm with my colleagues at work, I'm talking in another way. And I know specifically it's generally used with like racial cultures. But where does this sort of create a challenge on our identity, our view of ourself, our emotional well-being? I mean,
yeah, it's a good question. And I feel it's just like you said, like this is a common thing that probably everybody does in some way or another. I think where it starts to have a mental health toll is kind of the duration of the switching, or the things that are assumed when we're making decisions to switch. So for example, we are doing this podcast from Utah. Some of us are a part of the religious majority here in Utah. Other people are not part of the religious majority here in Utah. And so there are definitely decisions made about what you want to talk about and when. So in Utah, it may be seen as acceptable by the broader culture to come into work and talk about going to church on Sunday or going to youth activities or any number of things and talk about them as though they are common parlance. Somebody who is not from that culture probably will not be welcome to talk about similar aspects of their lives in the same way. And we don't know why this is. Some of that is probably true from the cultural constraints, but some of that is related to the story that somebody who is not a part of that culture is telling themselves. And some of it has been learned over time when somebody who's not a part of the religious majority tries to share something, and then there's like language clashes or like there's differences in understanding that then makes it harder to want to engage in that kind of talk in the future. And so I used to work at the university that's associated with the religious majority here. And I'm like, it's so weird. I can like go to work and then I can go downstairs to the store and I can like buy my underwear. And then I could go and like talk to and like I could talk about all of these things at work. But like at my current workplace, I would not talk about any of those things because that environment is very different. Even though I'm a part of the religious majority of the state, most of the people at my work are not a part of the religious majority. And so I very rarely talk about church things. And so the problem comes in considering that like those kind of things are big parts of my life. There's examples of times where I may not be showing up in the ways that people expect me to, and people may not always know to ask questions about that if their cultural norm is different from mine. So like, oh yeah, why didn't Kimberly come out with us to the bar? Well, it's because I don't drink, but maybe I'm not talking about that because of some rule I have about this code switching thing. If everybody else is talking about drinking, I'm not going to talk about not drinking because then I'm not cool.
Right.
Or if people say, why didn't Kimberly come to this after work event with us? Sometimes it's hard to explain to people, like my husband is and even this is kind of code switching, right? Because I don't know who's going to be listening to this. So I'm not saying my husband's been a bishop for the past 7 years. I'm going to say to you, my husband is a volunteer ecclesiastical leader in our church community. And so like it is already like so many more words. Right. And so the reason why people don't want to code switch all the time is because it's much more efficient to talk about things that you understand with people who understand them, because you can say them with a shared language, and that also brings shared connection. So that imagine being like the only person of color in your workspace. It means a lot of things. First of all, everybody is like human still. So there will still be things to talk about. It's not like you couldn't talk about anything, but it's less easy to talk about shared cultural traditions. And so then you just don't talk about those things. Or, I grew up in the South, and sometimes I have language that people don't understand. And so then I've just learned to not use the words because I tell myself my own stories in my head about being misunderstood. So even using language that I feel like is pretty common in my culture that people don't understand will start to send the message in my mind about like belonging or lack thereof or different things. Yeah. And so that, I think, is where the trouble starts. It can lead people to feel isolating. It gives a lot of power to like dominant structures in an environment to not be aware of this. And also there are risks. So being a therapist, I've learned to kind of talk in this sort of even tone, but I would rather talk to you guys like I talk to everybody on the street. And so like once I get to know someone, I will loosen up in my language. But when I first meet them, I am often more formal because I'm trying to set an impression. And so this is another example of code switching that usually fades over time. But then imagine if in certain contexts you feel like you have to do that all the time. Like I always have to be more formal with these people because my form of speaking is not something that's understood. Then that will create a toll over time. And then where are those spaces where you feel like you just be authentic, lay your hair down, and we know about people of color that they tend to experience mental health difficulty through a lot of internal experiences. So they're not necessarily things that people can see. And so then you want to be mindful of just like the constant and chronic ways that people are changing something about themselves because of believing that they won't be perceived a certain way because it just takes a toll over time.
I can imagine there's some tension there at times, like with code switching, right? Like how do you speak to that tension between, fitting in or authentically showing up yourself, right? Like I imagine there's an emotional toll there at times. That's a lot of brain power being used in those.
Yeah, for sure. When I moved to Utah, so I'm not from here, obviously. Well, I don't know if it's obvious. I'm Black. It's pretty obvious. So my family grew up in the South. I went to school in New York City, and then by way of Boston came here. And when I lived in North Carolina and then moved to New York, it was overwhelming in one way because I was used to Black Americans and having a shared history. So I wasn't super mindful of how much you can communicate with people and have that be a shared experience, especially because being a part of the religious majority here meant that I was part of a religious minority at home. And so then I was often mindful of not having things in common with other Black Americans because of not sharing this Black church context. But then when I went to New York and I had this Black American perspective and there was Black Caribbean perspectives and the African perspective, people from all kinds of different countries. And I'm I could talk to them and they wouldn't necessarily understand what I was saying. There is a shared language that has come through cultural traditions like hip hop or food we eat and stuff. And so then we do have that stuff. But then there were sometimes I'm you just don't get where I'm coming from. And so I really struggled to figure out what my place was. But then when I moved to Utah, I found myself wanting to be with Black people all the time. I often told people it felt like my bones were leached. And this is just something very internal that I'm man, I want to feel like home. It's like being hungry for something that your grandma used to make or something. You get used to certain tones, certain draws, certain reactions to things. Yeah. One of the things I realized is when I'm trying to solve a problem, I want people to talk back to me. And very commonly, the dominant culture here is if somebody has a problem, you listen to them say the whole problem and then you give feedback afterwards, which I hate because I feel I'm not if there's something that I want to correct in my train of thought, the way that I'm used to talking, especially in the South and then some from the North, people will just interrupt you or either they'll validate something or they'll say that, you're off base on that, but you have that real-time feedback. And so if I talk and I'm trying to solve a problem and nobody responds to me, I'm oh, shoot. I've done something wrong. People haven't heard me. Similarly, and this is kind of what influences the decisions to code switch, if I tried to give real-time feedback to other people, because that is like my cultural perspective or practice, then people are like, oh, she's being rude, or oh, she's being like, there's like all of these interpretations on it based on the culture. And so it is so nice to just be around a group of people that like more or less has the same set of rules. You don't worry as much about offending people. You can, like a lot of this is like safety seeking that you may or may not need to do, like from a psychological standpoint. Like we don't always need to be seeking safety, and there are just realities in these kind of things. We go to people who look like us, or we think that we have things in common. And so, I realized that it was taking a toll, especially when I moved here, and I was like, oh yeah, I need something different.
How did you learn to cope with that? I mean, you have your professional background, so you're probably doing some self-analysis and therapy, but how have you and how are you coping with that?
Yeah. So when I was in grad school, I did my doctoral research project on queer religious intersections, and so then got into a lot of the identity development stuff. And so it talks about integration as being the goal. Like ideally, people can just go into a space and be everything that they are, and like no one identity is more salient than another identity. And, that's like great. And you tend to have the least mental health effects if you're able to achieve that. So when it comes to like queer and religious stuff, it's like if somebody can inhabit a life as like a queer religious person and they're not fighting with themselves about that, then they will tend to have less of a deleterious effect. Or if they like opt out, they will also tend to not have as much of a deleterious effect. But like both of those things are really like they're loaded things, right? How do you live as a queer religious person? Like that takes its own navigation. What does it mean to leave one of the identities that you have seen as meaningful?
Yeah.
Like that is a process. And so they talked about how many people will practice compartmentalizing. So like letting one version of their identity be salient at certain contexts and then letting something else lead in other contexts, which is kind of like what code switching does. It's deciding which part of your identity you want to be salient in that moment. And that resonated with me because I'm like, I'm kind of a compartmentalized kind of girl. Like growing up as a Black Mormon, like you can't draw too much attention to the Black part or else it gets kind of weird. And so then my coping strategy was just to be all in. So I was like I was memorizing all the scriptures. I was going to all the events. Like I was just like super active in everything. And this is actually a pretty common experience for queer religious people as well. Like they will often use this compartmentalized strategy of like, I'm going to go all in on this thing, but then I'm going to go over here and like be all in on that thing, or I will like hide that thing. Hiding the thing is not something that I am like able to do. And so it really is more about like when I enter this space, this is the role that I'm inhabiting and I'm going to like live in that.
Yeah.
And so that strategy does have like pretty strong negative mental health effects, but it also has strong positive ones as well. And so when we're talking about something like code switching, like people will stay in this mode like as a survival strategy because like it can become hard to weigh out the pros and cons in the moment. Like it feels safer to lead with this thing. It feels safer to switch what I'm presenting to you. Like I feel like I'm avoiding consequences by doing that. But it has been helpful to just know that I have more options than compartmentalization to make me more mindful of like, well, who do I want to be in this space? So Luke, you were kind of saying like it takes a lot of mental energy to filter stuff. And so when I took this new job as an administrator at the place I've been working for years, one of the first things I said to them was, guys, I have been spending a lot of energy filtering my responses. And if I'm going to take this administrative job, I will not have that energy anymore. Yeah. So I'm like, this is my announcement that you may see different behaviors from me, but it's because I cannot, I cannot do what I was doing anymore. And that is not always a viable thing for everybody to do. Like I feel pretty supported at work, but I do think it's something that you can decide internally. Just remember, like I have the freedom to decide how I'm presenting. Yeah. If I feel like I have to interact by a certain rule or like unwritten structure to things? Do I have room to question that, challenge that, to find other avenues? And so then now, if I look myself up on ChatGPT or whatever, then I have this rep of being like pretty intersectional always. And I think that has like kind of been my thing since moving here, because it like people know that I'm Black because you see me. People know that I'm a part of this religious majority because they figure it out, and they know like all these other things about me. And there was a period of time that I was like, I got to keep this separate from this. But like, because who I am influences like everything I do, and like I am less good at picking and choosing that now, or I'm just choosing not to put the energy that way, then yeah, it's been freeing to be more mindful of when I feel trapped in making a decision to be a certain way versus when I feel like I have the freedom to decide how I want to be. And that has been the thing that makes a difference to me.
Yeah.
Well, you're an incredible asset to this community because your unique background, I think, gives you a natural empathy, very authentic, natural empathy for marginalized groups. And you've specialized to some extent, not just in racial minorities, but in the LGBTQ community and other marginalized groups. And I think that you're an asset in the community because Utah's a great place to live, but from a diversity standpoint, we could make lots of improvements. So maybe we could just talk a little bit about, the marginalized communities and what I don't think that everyone who's listening even understands the mental health toll that just being a member of a marginalized community can take on your day-to-day life. Maybe you can just talk a little bit about that.
I have a question that kind of goes along with that, because, early on, and you talked about this, like what signals teach people that they feel it's necessary to code switch. You kind of gave some examples of that, right? But kind of to echo his question, like what impact does that early adjustment to do this have on someone's identity formation or their confidence?
Yeah, those are both good questions. When you were talking, I was thinking about Encircle, the organization that is here in Utah for queer people. And it is not inherently religious at all, but and they've tried, I think, to have their own unique voice in terms of what role they're playing in this space. But also when they were first starting out, pretty much everything they had to do needed to be somewhat familiar to the language of the majority culture here. And this is something that I think people from minority communities, from marginalized communities get used to doing. If I want to enter in this space, I need to know how the other person talks. And so I often feel that is not returned. And gosh, there's so many examples of really any time that a majority culture tries to understand, or the DEI initiatives in the past few years are a good example of this. And I don't want to get too controversial, but what I think people learned is that you couldn't just invite people into a space and have them be welcome, but you also couldn't artificially tell somebody how to interact with someone and have that work as well. And so why we're seeing some of the trends that we are now is because it is true that the efforts that were put into place probably were not the most effective ones. You can't teach somebody all about bias and then expect them to be able to incorporate that in a meaningful way. The research shows that you have to give people, either you give people examples and let them follow through, or you make environmental changes. But changing the ways that somebody talks about things or the way somebody understands things most of the time will not work the way that you want it to. And this is like, it
Right.
maybe it shouldn't be any surprise, because like on a therapy level, if somebody comes to me and talks about something that like somebody did, the first thing I say is like, well, you can't control like what they did. You can only control like how you respond, or like the things that you tell yourself. And so that I do think that there is like this tension there when we're trying to figure out the thing to do that I just want to name. But while people are figuring that out, that is like also a toll on marginalized communities. And so like most spaces that I've experienced that have tried to be open to more diverse perspectives, I am like so grateful for. But a lot of times there comes a space where the language that the invitee is communicating in is different than the language than the person who was invited in. And then at that moment, it's really hard for a marginalized person to not retreat to other strategies they have to deal with that situation, to apologize, to say, oh, just kidding, it's not that big of a deal. Because like sometimes I wonder, as somebody like entering a new space, if it's really worth the complexity of like having somebody understand me. Like maybe they take all this time to understand my perspective, but then they're like, oh yeah, we're not gonna bring another Black person on, or we're not gonna bring, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that also takes a toll when you're trying to live life, you're trying to go to work, you're trying to find spaces to make you happy, and then you hit these environments that just aren't used to having you there. And even if they are like the most welcoming people in the world, like their system may not be built to welcome you. And eventually it's like if, you know, we're at a building today that has escalators and elevators. And so we call this inclusive, but like if the elevator was far away, is that inclusive? If the escalator is broken and nobody ever fixes it, is that inclusive? If the places where we want people to travel also haven't been built, like, so like if this building we're in right now wasn't built, which it's not, I don't think. Well, I guess they have to be. Anyway, you see my point.
Yeah.
So like sometimes like we try to welcome people in, but we are not prepared to do it. And then from the perspective of a marginalized person, we don't always know whether somebody is ready to commit to all of the work that's necessary. And so everybody has a different response to that. So mine is usually to retreat. Other people's responses to like rage about it and like everything in between. But that really is doing a lot of damage to the inside. It is affecting the stories that we tell ourselves. Like we all want to believe that we're humans of worth, that we like can hope for a future and deserve good things in life. And so every time there's a situation where I feel like a space isn't built for me, I have to like contest that in my mind. There are so many ways that being like a Black woman is so helpful, because sometimes I don't feel like I have this global sense that the world is fair. So like I'm not constantly expecting that things will be good when I enter them. But even that belief takes a toll, because like, what if the next time I want to like achieve something and I'm like, oh, well, you know, like if it doesn't work out the first time, second time, third time, if I then assume that it's because like the environment's not built that way, there's like pros and cons to that, right? Because not everybody has the energy, the capital, socially or otherwise, to then build environments that work for them. And so, yeah. And we know mental health wise that people of color tend to go to therapy or seek therapy less often. And then by the time they get there, their problems
Is that a cultural reason?
Yeah, it's probably multi-determined. So some people do get cultural messages that like not to tell your business to strangers.
That right there, what you just said, that's a common thing in the Black community. That's not anyone else's business. I've heard that.
Yeah, you want to keep it internal. There's a woman, a social worker named Dr. Joy, and she has this theory of post-traumatic slave syndrome, which I don't know if I buy like all the aspects of it, but it really is interesting when you think about how transgenerationally we have learned potentially to keep things private, because if too much was disclosed back in those times, it would mean deleterious consequences. So, for example, she uses like on a plantation, if a slave son was praised for like being a hard worker or something, what that would mean eventually is that son would then get sold off. And so to counteract that, they might learn to say, oh, he's all right. Or like, he's not that big. And so then we have this practice in their culture now where like, I don't know. I know that my parents were proud of me, but sometimes they'd be like, oh yeah, like, she's not like, oh, she's so smart. She's so great. Oh, she works hard. So like, it's already like turned down. But then somebody hearing that, like a child hearing that might be like, oh, like my parents aren't proud of me because they get all these other messages about how all these other people are responding. And so like, none of that is bad. It's all built in, like just things that are learned. But yeah, it's just, it's things to think about.
Right.
That analogy of like elevator, if someone's in a wheelchair or the escalator, that makes so much sense because all those things are, for a building, it's built out of code or policy. Mm-hmm. Kind of like DEI, you talked about like that's, okay, this is the policy, right? All are welcome. We need to start hiring. Like but it's out of policy, right? So it's, which is not the right way to do it. It's way more complex than that.
Right. You want to change people's hearts, and policy does not often change people's hearts. It often earns people's ire. And I feel like that's one of the main,
Some of those DEI efforts, they build resentment, right? Because
and then nobody gets what they want that way. So businesses want diversity because diversity of perspectives means more business. And so there are certain things that are more reinforcing. And then for the person who needs that difference, that they just want to feel safe and do their work, and that's how they're going to optimize performance. But preparing for bias is really helpful for people of color to know how to navigate environments. It's protective for us. And so like when I go to a DEI presentation, I'm like, yeah, this is great. Because then I feel supported. But like we know that talks about racism and stuff activates the fear centers in our brain. Really for everyone, like pretty much everyone who is American has this shared racial trauma history of like the impact of enslavement. And so when you activate that fear response for people, you probably will just not get the results you want. And so, how do you balance that? But you're right, Dave. I wish it was something that people understood more, because I think even having a conversation like this is risky because sometimes to me it seems so far out of what people are willing to take in. Like I sense that if people like met me on the street or they wanted to work with me or like came across me some other way, that they would be much more open to like the complexities of my life than they would if it's like, oh, we're going to talk about this subject. It's like, oh, no, I can't talk about that. Yeah. Like a little bit of that is like the amygdala happening. And so, with these initiatives where you just like showed up to work one day and they're like, we're going to talk about this for 4 hours. It's like flooding for people. But we do got to figure out a better way to kind of connect on a human level and then show it's really not that hard to be curious about people's perspective, to like understand where they come from. There's so much that we want to assume that we know about people, but like we don't. Like, I don't know what you guys eat in your houses. Like, I don't know what you feel about your family. Like, I don't know any of that. And so, if we could just get more effective at asking like honest, curious questions, I feel like we would get a lot of where we need to go in understanding the experience of the marginalized and incorporating that into the environments.
Yeah, that's kind of where a question I was going there, because it is, at the end of the day, like you strip it all away, like we're all humans, right? In a perfect world, we're treating each other as human beings, right? But where have you seen, because this is not done well, all these initiatives and policies and stuff, where have you seen examples of this done well, or, in workplaces, schools, groups, how can they reduce the need for this code switching?
Mm-hmm. When you were talking, I was thinking about, so my first baby, I delivered in New York, and, New York is a pretty diverse place, but it's also a pretty segregated place, and people are used to folks having certain experiences. And so, like, one time I went to a routine checkup, and there was, like, my husband's insurance was through the Board of Education, but it happened to be provided by the same provider as the Medicaid provider. And like I saw, coincidentally, maybe I was also waiting for longer than I thought I needed to be waiting. And so like when I went up to the desk, I saw where somebody had written like Medicaid, like in big letters on the copy of my insurance card. And I was like, why did you write this here? And so you like draw conclusions on like what this means, right? Because there's like no shame in Medicaid and all of this. But I wondered, I will say, if something different was happening because this distinction was made. And so, like, that's kind of on the negative end of, like, there's some understanding of, like, different cultural experiences that is on the shaping curve, I call it. Like, it's somewhere along the way of what we want to be aware of, but, like, not the ideal. Versus when I had my second baby, I was here in Utah, and there's a lot of statistics, and the statistics have been true for years, but in certain times there was just like more attention on it. Black maternal health outcomes were especially poor. Like Black women were 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. And there was a lot of stuff around Serena Williams, like them not managing her pain in the hospital. And so then you get this story of it being like even cross socioeconomic statuses, which like usually most people will like put things about race on socioeconomic status, but then this thing with Serena Williams happened and people were like, yeah, we gotta. And so when I had my second child, they asked me about my pain medication like every 10 minutes. Like, are you okay? Like, do you have, and they were asking me questions like, what is your pain experience? How would you rate it? Like, what you should be feeling is more like this. Do you want us to give you more medication? And I know like people will have opinions on this because they're like, oh, hospitals, like they just want to like, and maybe they just wanted to upcharge me. I don't know. But I felt like it, and then like, I don't know, all through the baby process, they were like testing me for hemophilia, which is like great, but like also low iron, which I do have. Like, there's some things about my life that are like very stereotypical. Yeah. Like my iron is bad. Like, please give me the supplements. But yeah, there used to be this belief that like Black women handled pain differently so that they could tolerate being given less pain medication. But the research showed that Black women were more likely to underreport how much pain they were experiencing. And so then my experience in the hospital with this second child was indicative to me of like how you take information and then ask questions about it. So they didn't assume that I wanted more drugs. That might have been a different birth experience, but they did. And maybe it would have been a fun one. Like, I don't know. There's pros and cons. But like, they were aware. Yeah, they were aware, but then they were like, okay, but tell me what you think about this in a way that I felt pretty cared for. And so, yeah, if we can take any of the information that we see in the world about people's experience and be like, yeah, does that affect you? Or like, what do you think about this? A lot of stuff, like when we were talking in the pandemic about like how to talk to people about racial issues, people would say like, you can't expect people of color to explain this to you, which I think is true. Like, you don't have to expect that someone will explain it to you because not everybody is going to be in a period of like identity development that they want to explain these things to you. Sometimes it's better to talk to like neighbors or friends or people who know, like people who won't stop running their mouth on various like media platforms, right. You know what I mean? But then sometimes, like, I think it is never wrong to ask someone because they hopefully will have the freedom to tell you whether they want to answer that or not. And there are some dynamics related to this code switching thing that we're talking about where like, it may look like somebody's being polite when they give you a response when they don't actually want to give you one. And this is where I think education is helpful. But I think that overall, if people just learn to ask more questions with the information that they learn so that they have a chance to incorporate it, that we would have a better world. We would have more understanding and we would have more opportunities. Like, don't assume stuff. Don't say silly stuff. Just ask me and I will probably tell you or give you some kind of feedback. But I also like knowing that people have like done homework and and gathered information, because I forever am gathering homework, social or otherwise, about how to interact in my dominant environment. And so then I feel cared for when people are curious about me.
So this is the Mental Fitness Podcast, and we kind of focus on a lot of the daily practices that people can do to build their mental fitness, whether that be healthy sleep and exercise habits, or regular daily connections with people and those types of things. So specific to this area, and I know it's a very complex area, and it's probably difficult to bring down to just some daily practices. But if we're speaking to marginalized communities, and the marginalized communities have much higher rates of mental health challenges as a result of all these things we've been talking about, what are some mental fitness tips? So I know you're a therapist, you don't usually give advice, but what are some practices that people in marginalized communities can do on a day-to-day basis to improve their mental fitness and develop the strength and skills to better combat this outside of the therapy setting? Yeah.
I think that engaging in value-centered action is so important. And so sometimes I think there was a question of surviving versus thriving. And I think sometimes code switching is a survival strategy, but sometimes it's a thriving strategy. Like if you're using it to build relationships then that's great. But if you're using it to figure out how to navigate your world, then you might want to consider how you can move based on what you want as opposed to what you think the environment wants. There's a proverb that I think is ascribed to some African people that says, if you walk with another man's legs, you'll get where that man wants you to go. And so following survival strategies will often displace you from what is important to you. And so sometimes it's good to just, if you don't know what's important to you, just center in and be like, what is important? What do I want in this situation? How do I want people to describe me? Who do I want to be in this setting? And then say, what are the actions that I can take to move toward that? We also just need to cultivate joy in our lives. There's one soul food place that I know of that is pretty close. And so then I make a plan to regularly visit. It's once a quarter I will go and get, there's a couple places in Draper that are just so good with the ribs and stuff. Anyway, and so we just need opportunities to cultivate joy, going to events, seeing people we love. Some people, spiritual practice is important to them, but then they'll find after weeks and weeks that they're not doing it. So being able to engage in things that bring you joy. And then for people of color, I think, especially here in Utah, there's a myth where that they're just not here, but they are here. They're everywhere. This weekend, there's probably 4 events that are for Black people. And so we're it could be, there's things for kids. There's things for the immigrant experience. There's this thing that I'm doing to raise money for BIPOC mental health. There's so many things going on. And so all we got to do is take some time to recognize that we are telling ourselves a story and then seeing if we can open it up. Yeah. Is that true? And so that's really the main thought trick that I feel I can get for free. Just open it up and see if it is true. But yeah, all the things that you mentioned, eating, sleep, those are also important to influence the stories that we tell ourselves. But yeah, we got to make room for joy, make room for opening up to experience and just experiencing more of what is important to us.
I love that. Those are great. No, thank you so much we're grateful to have you on our podcast. This last segment, kind of a fun one, just rapid fire questions. Not all of them are, mental health related.
Okay, not thinky.
So
I'm ready.
If you weren't a psychologist or a doctor, what career would you love to have tried?
Oh, man. Well, I used to want to be a teacher. I think that would still be good, but part of me wants to be a farmer. Just go live off the land.
I love that.
What's your favorite way to recharge after a long weekend? Or after a long week?
I watch a lot of reality TV.
Yeah. Okay. I love that. What's one food you're never tired of eating?
Sweet potatoes, for sure. Or coconut. I could eat. Oh,
Wow.
just
that's
give
awesome.
it.
I love it. What's a song or artist that always lifts your mood?
Earth, Wind, and Fire. I also listen to a lot of gospel music, but Earth, Wind, and Fire is like my pop go-to.
What's something that recently made you laugh really hard?
I don't know. It was probably some like social media commentary or something stupid. I couldn't tell you specifically.
Okay, and last question. In one sentence, what does mental fitness mean to you?
Working out your mind. Did I do it?
Working out your mind.
3 words. 3 words is even better than a sentence. That's a sentence.
I love it. Working out your mind. Awesome. Well, thank you, Kimberly.
Yes,
this
thank
was
you so
great.
much.
I think, Luke, one of my favorite parts, I mean, the code switching was fascinating to me. That's just something that I'm still learning a lot about. That was really interesting. But I also really loved just what drew Kimberly to where she is today. And I just feel that she's got her heart in the right place.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, for me, I mean, yeah, super fascinating. The thing that really we didn't even talk about it, but we just have so much work to do as a society in these areas. Like
We could get there.
that's what stands out to me.
I have faith.
Well, thank you very much, Kimberly. We appreciate it.
Thank you.